If you've never watched a silent film, you're in the right place. Today we're going to be talking about Intolerance, one of the greatest silent films of all time by D.W. Griffith, with, of course, Peter Rayner, our film knowledge expert extraordinaire. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Popcorn Talk, featuring movie discussion, news, and interviews. Popcorn Talk. We talk movies.
And a lot of it has been written about me, as it's written about all sorts of people who don't deserve it, and they give me credit for innovations which I'm not responsible for and inventions that I didn't invent. And then other people come along and say I don't deserve the credit, and I want to tell you that I've never claimed that credit. I mention all this because the film you're going to see tonight deserves all the credit that can possibly be given to it. It was made just a year after I was born. And there's almost nothing in the entire vocabulary of the cinema which you won't find in this film. There's also a lot of it which is terribly old-fashioned. And it was old-fashioned, I'd like to point out, even at the time when this film was shown. Because its author and maker and creator was D.W. Griffith, and I may say parenthetically that the film is Intolerance, had his grounding, came out of, and in every way was the child of the 19th century, the late 19th century theater, so you're going to see a lot of the late 19th century theater in this film. A lot that was old and dusty even at the moment that this was made. And you're also going to see an awful lot that would be new tomorrow because of the genius of the man. His taste and his culture, his background belonged to quite another time.
So that is, of course, Orson Welles talking about Intolerance and D.W. Griffith. First of all, let's welcome back Peter Rayner for coming back. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joelle. Great to be here as always.
Excellent. I was so excited when you suggested this movie. One, I've only ever seen D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. That's the film that they show you in school when they want to talk about the silent era of film. So I was excited to dive into something that also wasn't one of the shorts that Mary Pickford did. Those kind of my silent era experiences. This movie is so large and so grand and so kind of exquisite in its exploration of the entire globe. What made you want to select it? Why do you think this is a film that we should still be talking about?
Well, Griffith was the great innovator and the great artist of movies in their infancy. There were other directors before him. He did not invent the close-up and a lot of things that people give him credit for, but he was the first director to really use the grammar of film in ways that were powerful and told stories and really struck home emotionally in ways that previous films had not. And he started out in New York. The Biograph Company, 1905, I think 1906 was when he actually started making films. Then he came out to California and did a number of Biograph films in California. He moved up a little bit from where he was to a place called Hollywood, and there was some issues at the time with the Edison Trust that owned a lot of the facilities, and they even owned the patent to the film itself, and there was some issues with that. So a lot of filmmakers came west to avoid the patent wars with Edison, who was in New Jersey, and they could always scoot across the border to Mexico if there was an issue. So Griffith really was the father of American movies in many, many ways. And he did hundreds of short films before he ever did any narrative feature films. Judith of Bethulia, I think, was the first feature film that he directed, and then there was the infamous Birth of a Nation. That film is great in many aspects and horribly racist in other aspects, and remains to this day a cause of great alarm and furor among people who give it credit for reviving the Ku Klux Klan. Griffith was a Southerner. He grew up in Kentucky in a Confederate family in a Confederate world. He made Intolerance, in his mind, to show that he was not a bigot or a racist, that he was, promoting,
Was this his response to Birth of a Nation then?
Yes.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, it was officially his response to Birth of a Nation. It was the first feature that he made after Birth of a Nation. There were some other short things in between, but basically this was his big response to the charges that had been made against him, rightly, I feel, about Birth of a Nation. And the film was, unlike Birth of a Nation, which was one of the most popular box office films of all time, Intolerance was a commercial disaster. It was a very expensive film. No film had been made on its scale like that. There was a film in Italy that was sort of a big budget event, but nothing like this. And it came out around the time that we were entering World War I, which didn't help the fact that this film is basically a kind of pacifist manifesto.
Sure.
So for all those reasons, and it's a bewildering movie because it has, 4 different historical eras that are filmed independently, but then at a certain point they all coalesce, and the cross-cutting between the modern story and the Babylonian story and so forth, I think was bewildering to audiences. And yet, I saw the film again a few years ago. I've seen it, but maybe half a dozen times. For all of what Wells was saying correctly, I think about its 19th century antecedents and its old-fashionedness and its derivations from stage, particularly in terms of its acting. It's a fantastically immediate and modern movie that looks forward to the whole history of cinema and the ways in which you could use film for its emotional depth charges, the use of close-ups, not just to, show somebody bigger, but to bring you close to their emotions, particularly in the modern sequences with the Mae Marsh character whose child is taken from her. Scenes like that are unbelievably powerful to this day. So that's sort of the setup to what Intolerance was. And even though it was not commercially successful, it was phenomenally successful aesthetically. There are scenes in this movie that were directly connected to what the Soviets were doing a short time later.
Oh, wow.
Sergei Eisenstein in The Strike and Potemkin, Pudovkin in Mother, and those movies were all, and they all wrote extensively, those directors, about Griffith and about the influence that he had on them.
Watching this movie, it's easy to see the Battleship Potemkin influences. The giant scene from the stairs and looking out at the boats in Potemkin. I would not have drawn the conclusion myself, but I definitely see it there.
Yeah, the Odessa Steps. The Babylonian scene in Intolerance features a huge flight of stairs in the palace, and I think Eisenstein does a bit better with those stairs than Griffith did. Nevertheless, the scope of it is quite amazing. If anyone here locally who goes to the Kodak theaters, that whole complex where the Oscars are and everything, if you move a bit over to above where the subways are and the restaurants, there's a sort of papier-mâché columns that are directly drawn from the Babylon set of Intolerance.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, next time you're there, check it out.
I will.
It's definitely there. The film of Intolerance was filmed where the Vista Theater used to be, sort of like, I think like Sunset Boulevard and Vista.
Okay, wow. Okay, so the heart of Hollywood.
Yeah, so that's where the set was built and everything's long gone, of course, but it was filmed right in the heart of Hollywood, and it employed just about everybody. There were all sorts of people who worked on these films who went on to directing careers of their own. John Ford was, I'm not sure if he was in Intolerance, but he was definitely an extra in The Birth of a Nation. Raoul Walsh, Alan Dwan, just tons of filmmakers and actors came out of Griffith's stable, and especially those 2 great films. So he, for me, the third of the great trilogy of Griffith films, and he made quite a few marvelous movies. Was Broken Blossoms with Lillian Gish, which is, there are times when I think that's like the greatest movie ever made, or certainly the greatest movie under 90 minutes. She plays a waif in London's Limehouse district, and Richard Barthelmess plays a Chinese guy who falls in love with this waif who's been terrorized by her brutal father. And that aspect of it was a great influence on La Strada, Fellini's film. Griffith had a stock company of actors that he used. Lillian Gish appeared in a great number of his movies. She's in The Birth of a Nation. She's in Intolerance, in a small role as the woman who rocks the cradle with a Whitman poem over it, the sort of linking the stories. But she's front and center in Broken Blossoms, and also Orphans of the Storm, which was another great French Revolution set epic that Griffith made after Intolerance.
If you guys haven't had an opportunity to watch Lillian Gish perform, or Mary Pickford for that matter, I literally just read like all about their lives the other day. They're like best friends, and both of their performances to this day. The New York Hat. Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm gonna collect myself. The New York Hat, starring Mary Pickford, is maybe some of the best acting you'll ever see on camera. It's like she invented acting for camera. It's incredible, and Lillian Gish does the same thing. That is so cool.
Yeah, and Pickford in the silent era was the most popular star in Hollywood. A woman, she was even more popular than Douglas Fairbanks.
I was reading that
married.
Like dignitaries would come to D.C. and then want to go to her house like afterwards. You're like, but can we go to the what did she call her place with Fairbanks?
Pickfair.
There we go.
Pickfair, which was. I go back here far enough to have seen it from afar. It was this huge, sprawling mansion that I think ultimately it was owned by Jerry Buss of the Lakers, and various people owned it. I believe it's been torn down now. But yeah, Pickfair was like the Shangri-La of Hollywood, and all of the royalty, both Hollywood and international, wanted to go there. But yeah, Pickford was America's sweetheart, and she was the most popular star in movies for a long time. She was an amazingly vivacious presence on film. I mean, it's easy to see why she was as popular as she was. And as you say, I mean, she sort of invented, because a lot of the acting in that era came out of the old theatrical tradition. And particularly in silent film, you had to kind of make grand gestures, right? You couldn't you didn't have dialogue to help you, so you had to emote in ways, physically that often looked, particularly to our eyes, somewhat stagey. Mm-hmm. But Douglas Fairbanks, who was in, Mask of Zorro and The Thief of Baghdad and all these films, Senior, was another huge star at the time. And it's tremendously fun to watch him, swashbuckle and jump all over the place. I mean, he was really...
He was robust.
Yeah, I mean, he had just tremendous energy, which carried on to the camera. And William S. Hart was another famous silent film star. He was a Western star. He had a kind of poker face, and he was very, he had an amazing face for the camera. And he was in Tumbleweeds and a number of these Westerns, extraordinarily popular, and was one of the people who set the myth of the West in Hollywood, along with actors like Tom Mix and others who really set the tone for what Westerns were and would become. And of course the silent film comedians.
Buster Keaton.
Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. Yeah. Also Harold Lloyd and Harry Langdon. These were geniuses. We can get to that in a moment.
What I like what you're laying out here are the seeds of what Hollywood becomes. And I think that's what's fascinating about exploring the silent era is kind of seeing the roots, the very first flowerings of what is to come next, specifically as we're looking at these giant blockbusters. I'm curious, Orson at the top of the show mentioned that there was a lot of 18th century or 1800s theater involved in the production of Intolerance, and you kind of see it in the staging and like if you've ever seen pictures from old operas, which are just magnificent to look at because the costumes are just incredibly detailed. They have these super elaborate sets, and you get a lot of that here too. What is the transition like? I'm curious what Griffith had to go through to convince people to make this movie, because it is Birth of a Nation is large scale, but a lot of it happens outside, and so that's easy enough. We don't have to build sets for that, but here we build these giant pieces. And what kind of obstacles did he face trying to just get the movie into production?
He didn't face that many obstacles because at the time he was king of the hill.
Sure.
He was the most popular. He'd made the most popular movie ever made, Birth of a Nation. He had his pick of any actor. He knew how to make movies upside and down. He it's the same today. You make a big blockbuster hit, and a lot of doors open for you. A lot of people say yes, and so he didn't have a great deal of trouble in financing the film. He just kind of it was an obsession, this movie, really. It was more than an obsession to show people that he wasn't a bad guy. It was also his absolute passion for the art of film. I mean, imagine, here's somebody at the birth of film, really, who is using it in ways that no one has really used it before. It's hard to imagine now because of the billions of feet of footage that have been shot and so much has been done. But at that time, he had so much at his disposal as an artist that few other directors had, and so the film is a little bit crazy, in a good way. I mean, it's kind of a folly, as people have described it, because imagine trying to pitch this to somebody if you didn't have the kind of power he had then.
Without the language of film, you have to describe something that hasn't been seen before.
Yeah, I mean, they say, well, that's fine, but you need to cut the budget back by 90% or something. But the whole point of this film was the scope of it. But not always, but most of the time, the scope of this film works to its advantage. I'm not saying that this was a great film because it suddenly, introduced these incredible sets and blah. I mean, DeMille movies did that too, and he did some silent films that were along the lines of Intolerance before he did, 10 Commandments and all those movies. They're not terribly good movies, I think, in retrospect. They're impressive, but they're not made by an artist. Intolerance is made by a great artist. And so it's not the size and the scale that really matters in the end, except maybe historically, but the passion that he put into it. And for me, the best of the sequences is the modern day sequence, where there's the least amount of historical hoo-ha and recreation. It's sort of the closest to the emotional cutting edge of the story and what he's putting across
Why
the
don't we
audiences.
take a look at this New York sequence so we can get an idea of what the size and scope of everything is, because it is rather impressive.
Yep.
For those listening, you cannot hear anything because it is in fact a silent film. First of all, beautifully shot. Black and white films don't always kind of glow like this, I don't think, as far as, getting that color range right between the grayscale can be very complicated. It's clear that a lot of attention was paid to detail to that here. It's a very large dancing scene. We've got people in prison and stockyards and fights.
These scenes are extraordinarily realistic. These strike scenes in the modern day sequence are really
to the point where you question it could be like documentary, like were they just
right,
like
exactly.
guerrilla shooting?
Yeah. He, in addition to everything else, he had a great eye for using documentary style footage in dramatic films. This is close to the climax of the movie. Our hero is about to be, Robert Harron is about to be hung for something he didn't really deserve. They're testing it out. Meanwhile, his wife, played by Mae Marsh, and the judge are racing to get the sentence
Reversed
because they have information that he didn't commit the crime. That's a close-up of Mae Marsh
Stunning.
when she has her baby taken away from her by child custody. That's see, all these stories coalesce in the end, and the war, and suddenly people stop fighting, and the clouds part.
Looks like there's a party in the kingdom of heaven.
Right, the prisons are liberated of all these wonderful guys who are in jail unjustly.
I think what's really incredible about this, first, as you say, the artwork.
And that's Lillian Gish rocking the cradle.
Just the control of the light throughout is really impressive. But
Yeah. Billy Bitzer was Griffith's cameraman on many of his early great films, and he deserves an amazing amount of credit for creating or developing a lot of camera effects that became standard much later on.
It's incredible work. I think, as somebody who's kind of like a history buff, when you think like this was shot 100 years ago, it's still wild to me to watch people like up and standing around and expressing the same emotions 100 years ago. And I think that's kind of the incredible thing about films, and specifically films like this that are touching on things people are concerned about. We're heading into our first great world war. It's a shocking time in history, and to see somebody come out with something like this, not just for pacifist reasons, but also somewhat to clear his own name. Do you know if it's true? I know I've heard a story perpetuated throughout the years, but I've never been able to get like a documented resource of it, which is that D.W. Griffith had a maid who he invited to come see Birth of a Nation. She had named her son after him. And then after the movie, I guess she was kind of appalled by the sentiment and upset, and that maybe that had an effect on him. Do you know if that's true?
I hadn't heard that anecdote.
Really? Okay.
I mean, it could be.
Okay.
I mean, there was a tremendous outcry, from there were black organizations that rallied against it. There were, a lot of. But it was shown in the White House when Woodrow Wilson was president at that time. Mm-hmm. And he was kind of a racist, actually. And so the film was projected for him, and he made this comment that was picked up everywhere saying it's like history written with lightning. And, he was just all over about how great this film was, which it is, but, with a large asterisk. So it... the best essay that's been written on Griffith, I think, is by James Agee in his collection Agee on Film, which was written when Griffith died in 1947. And Agee too was a Southerner, but he said that making allowances for what that film was. And it's funny, he doesn't talk much about intolerance in that essay, but how he describes what Griffith was as an artist, and how he, just what he set in motion for the rest of filmmaking is unparalleled as a piece of critical writing on a director. But Griffith lost it when he was riding high. I mentioned Fairbanks and Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin. The four of them broke away from the studio system as it existed at that point and created what was called United Artists. United Artists was, here were the four most powerful people in Hollywood who decide, we're going to form our own company so we can make the films that we want to make without any interference from any of these moguls. And ultimately, the company, disbanded. But Griffith, Charlie Chaplin, of course, did some of his greatest silent films under that aegis. But he made silent films in the sound era, unlike everybody else, because Chaplin had the power to go silent even through the mid-30s.
Yeah.
You don't realize, he made City Lights and Modern Times and The Gold Rush. I think particularly City Lights and Modern Times, when silent film was no longer happening. No one was making silent films anymore.
Was he of the same mind as Mary Pickford that adding sound was like, what did she say, putting lipstick on the Venus de Milo?
Yeah, because the tramp character, the Charlie Chaplin, little tramp, really exists silent. I mean, he did speak a little bit. It's not really a tramp film. The Great Dictator. He speaks there, but basically, it's a character that unlike so many silent characters, actually was benefited by silence. It wasn't just because they were only making silent movies. So and Chaplin feared that once sound came in, and he had a kind of high voice and it went in a British accent. He was British, so I think he just felt that would ruin his whole persona on
He
film.
saw it ruin a lot of his colleagues.
Yeah, it did. I mean, there were a lot of actors who did not survive the silent era, and Mae Marsh, who was such a great actress in so many of these early films. I forget, the poet Vachel Lindsay wrote a poem about her once. He said she's the Madonna of cinema with the something or other in her eyes. I mean, it was wonderful what he wrote about her. She survived as an actress for many, many years, but mostly in small roles. John Ford was a great friend of hers and champion, so he would always put her into, supporting roles in his films. But Pickford didn't really do a whole lot in the sound era. Fairbanks, ditto, and it was only Chaplin who had the power to make silent films in the sound era, and even that only lasted until 1940 when he did The Great Dictator and went fully into sound, and Monsieur Verdoux in 47 he completely went against the tramp character. He had to. Griffith was a director who. Way Down East was a phenomenal film and a great success. It has famous scene of Lillian Gish having to be rescued on an ice floe as it's going through the water, over the falls.
Oh my goodness!
And she actually she put her hand in the frozen water, and to the end of her days it was a problem. And I mean, the guy rushing, jumping from ice floe to get to her before the. But it's a terrific movie. Orphans of the Storm is a terrific movie. He made a World War I movie set in Germany that is a forerunner of neorealism called Isn't Life Wonderful? It was a big influence on De Sica and Rossellini and those directors when they did their neorealist films after World War II. Even his last movie, The Struggle, which is derided so much, that and Abraham Lincoln, but The Struggle is about an alcoholic, and Griffith became a very heavy drinker in his life, but it has some incredible scenes in it. But he ended up, kind of living in the Knickerbocker Hotel, drinking a lot. All of the people that he brought into the business were running the business and making movies, and he was in his hotel room. He was given an honorary Oscar by the Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and he said, "What art? What science?" It was a difficult story. Ezra Goodman, in a book called the Decline and Fall of Hollywood, was one of the last people to actually get an interview with Griffith, and he only did it by essentially letting him think that there was a girl he was bringing up to the room and some drinks, and then he broke into the hotel and sat him down, and they did this interview, which is really quite amazing, where Griffith finds, all right, you got me. Then he opens up and talks about his whole life and history in Hollywood. But it was true of a lot of silent film giants that they didn't really make the transition well. The worst is Buster Keaton. I mean, Buster Keaton is arguably, at least Chaplin's equal. As a director, he's a greater director. He was an amazing director, Keaton. If you look at films like Sherlock Jr. and The Navigator, I mean, they're amazingly well directed.
His stunts are beautifully shot. Like, they're incredible stunts in and of themselves, but then the way he composes the shot to highlight the stunt is always beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, he had an incredible eye. I'm not sure he even knew that he had it, but he was a vaudevillian who, his parents threw him around the stage. That's where he got the name Buster, and but he was an incredible director, and all of these silent comics, but especially Keaton, worked with great improvisation and intuitively. And when the studio system, clicked in and sound came in the 30s. These guys were bereft because suddenly they had to, follow orders and call sheets and things that they'd never had to do before. and it just didn't work. And it's not because Keaton's voice. I mean, you've probably heard him in, Beach Blanket Bingo or something. But, I mean, Keaton had the perfect voice for that. Unlike Chaplin,
Yeah.
Keaton's voice perfectly fit his kind of, physicality and great stone face, which was actually very, very expressive. He talked like this, and it was, but and he did a number of sound films that were actually pretty funny. But he ended up writing gags for Danny Kaye and Jimmy Durante and a lot of other comics.
Do you just attribute that to the nation kind of wanting to move on? Like there's a new wave of technology and we just don't want to be, because Buster looked really like, even into Sunset Boulevard, his little bit role there, he's like comedic gold for the 2 seconds he's on screen. It's so funny. And he's a good looker, so it always kind of astounded me how many people were able to just kind of be let go.
Yeah, I don't know if I didn't. I should probably have marked this, but I have an essay on Keaton.
I love when we go to the book. It's my favorite.
Okay, here we go. Yeah, I mean, Keaton, there have been many documentaries, some very good ones on Keaton, including Kevin Brownlow, who did an amazing documentary on not only Keaton, but Griffith and Chaplin. And the whole silent era. I mean, he's sort of the great chronicler of silent film, but also, Richard Schickel did a wonderful documentary on Charlie Chaplin, so did Peter Jones and others. Anyway, this is Rayner on Film, 30 years of film writing in a turbulent and transformative era. End of shameless plug. But the Keaton, let me just pick one thing about, because Steamboat Bill Jr. is one of the funniest movies ever made. It has so many classics. There's one scene in it which, to this day, people gasp. Is a huge tornado in this small country town, and he's standing there while the facade of a house falls right over him.
Yes.
And the window that's cut out of the top floor, falls on him.
Frames right over him.
Frames over him.
That's crazy.
That was not
It's
that
practical.
was
It's real.
It's real. I mean, he could have been killed
Easily.
I mean, it's whoa.
The clock tower too is real too. When he's hanging off the clock,
Yeah.
that is just insane.
And Harold Lloyd in Safety Last.
Thank
yeah.
you. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it all of this stuff. It's quite amazing. I mean, Keaton got really banged up over the years. He he broke his collarbone many times, but
The original Tom Cruise.
yeah. Well, I've never heard the two of them spoken. But I mean, I say, like, at the beginning and at the end of his career, Keaton's face was a classic. James Agee wrote that Keaton's face in his silent films ranked almost with Lincoln's as an early American archetype, and the face he presented at the end, from the drivel of Beach Blanket Bingo movies to the more high-toned drivel of Samuel Beckett's film, was archetypal as well. It was a face of a slap-shoed, flat-hatted vaudevillian turned soulful. It was a face that told us there was more resonance in the comic's art, more ghostliness than you might have ever imagined. In the movies, his sorrowful bewilderment gave his extraordinary handsomeness a spirituality that at bottom was not comic or meant to be. When sorrow ceases to be mysterious, it becomes pathos. That's what separates good Keaton from bad Chaplin. Keaton never really asked for love in his movies, but we in the audience felt protective anyway. Only the girls in his movies immediately perceive his innate grace and sensitivity. Keaton's athleticism was funny and fraught with pratfalls, but it was also robust and full of Yankee cunning. His mixture of somnolence and derring-do was sexy. He never failed to get the girl at the end, although he always seemed perplexed about what to do with her once he got her. That's because Keaton was also and ultimately the archetypal loner. In the midst of crowds, he seemed most alone, and that aloneness, emblematized in his face, was the still center of his art. So, that's Keaton. I mean, Keaton is to this day, I think, almost avant-garde in some of the Sherlock Jr. He plays as a movie projectionist who enters into the film. And, I mean, that was kind of Dada and avant-gardist, back then in the 20s. And here he is, this, silent comic vaudevillian who's doing all this crazy, weird, amazing stuff. Chaplin, I think, is, for me, City Lights is such a, especially is such an ineffable movie, and the final close-up of that film where the he's restored the sight to this blind flower girl, and she doesn't know that he's the one who did it. She thought it was some rich suitor who disappeared after she got her sight because he couldn't bear for her to see him as this poor tramp. But at the end of the movie, she recognizes that this is who it is, and she says, you, and he just kind of looks, and he has this flower, and he's smiling, and the close-up of him is, I think, many people have agreed with the greatest single shot in movies. It is filled with every possible emotion, extreme sorrow, extreme happiness, everything. It's the most amazing piece of acting. So there was such a wealth of greatness in these silent films. Lillian Gish was a great actress who did, to some extent, move into the sound era. We did Night of the Hunter a while back, and she's marvelous in that. She's in Duel in the Sun. She's in The Cobweb, a lot of movies. I met her once. The AFI, briefly. The AFI had a Lifetime Achievement Award.
Wow.
That's when they were still giving awards to people who were over 40, who weren't going to get a high Nielsen rating.
Yes.
But she lived into her 90s, and she wrote a very interesting book called The Movies, Mr. Griffith and Me. And she directed a movie too.
I did not know that.
The
Lillian
White
directed.
Sister. Yeah, she
Wow.
directed a film. She was one of the Lois Weber and a number of other women were directing early on in the silent era. But she directed one movie, and one movie only, and then she remarked afterwards that she didn't think that directing was a fit job for a woman.
Of course.
But the greatness of her acting, I think, shows up most in two films that were not directed by Griffith, but by a Swedish import to Hollywood, Victor Sjöström, who did two films called The Wind and then an adaptation of Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. And in both of those films, she gives just among the greatest of performances ever. And if you've ever read Scarlet Letter and you imagine her as Hester Prynne, and it's Sjöström was a great director in his own right, and I believe he used some of the same cinematographers that Griffith did.
So it seems there was no lack of talent lost as we move into the studio system. Women did kind of lose out. We had a lot of women taking a stab here and there directing. Mary Pickford is consistently directing at the time. Up until the sound era comes out, we lose a lot of our great actors. But Intolerable kind of lays the groundwork for big blockbuster pictures, which is what we're going to talk about when we come back next time. Thank you so much for walking us through the silent era and giving us so many great books to read and movies to go see. I know I'm definitely going to be rewatching City Lights tonight because you got me all nostalgic for it, and it's a great movie. I'll also be reading Kevin Brownlow's book on Keaton, because that sounds really fascinating. I love Buster Keaton, but I don't know that much about him. So thank you so much for being here with us again. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Joelle. Thank you.
Guys, we'll be back next week at 4 o'clock. Back here, Peggy will be back with us. So we'll see you next Thursday.
From producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, Phil Svitek, and the entire Popcorn Talk Network, we would like to thank you for tuning in. For questions or comments, be sure to visit popcorntalk.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been a presentation of the Popcorn Talk Network.
The views expressed herein are those of the hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Popcorn Talk Network or its owners or principals.